So there's so much learning that can happen in organizations when they're doing a great job assessing their progress, figuring out where they're at, and then how they can use that evidence to adjust their pathway forward. When we see places where innovation projects continually advance and move forward over a period not just of weeks but of months or years, one of the features of some of the best of those projects is that there are teams of people that are getting together and saying, how are we doing? What can we learn from how we're doing to be able to move forward? It's pretty tough in schools, though, and it may even be tougher in schools than it is in some of the other sectors of society that you've worked in. And I don't know, maybe could you tell us a little bit about how you see some of that, Peter, of what are some of the particular challenges of thinking about assessment in school contexts?
Well, one of the reasons it often does seem to be tougher in schools than in the business, say, for example, is I think there's a tendency in schools to kind of mix up assessment and evaluation. And the words get used almost as if they're synonyms. Technically, they're not, and I think it's a real problem for this reason. For me, I think anybody who thinks about learning, assessment is inescapable. If you're a little kid, if you can't tell the difference between 2 steps and 9 steps, you can't learn to walk.
Yep.
So assessment in the sense of a learner making a judgment of how they're doing relative to their aspiration, no assessment, no learning.
Yep.
It's absolutely inescapable. But evaluation basically takes the phenomenon of assessment, how am I doing, and adds a judgment. So like, oh God, I'm never going to learn to walk, I've only gone 2 steps, and that's not going to be very helpful for a learner, right? That adding of a value judgment. And I think it's always confounded in an educational context because all of us have the internalized traumas of failing on a test, where basically you've got another dimension entirely, which is another person is judging my performance and telling me I'm not doing very well.
Yeah.
So that confusion of assessment and evaluation and who's doing the assessing for what purpose is really gets the whole thing kind of a muddle. But so if you go back to basics in the context we're talking about here, where we're all trying to kind of work together to bring about changes, if you don't measure, you don't assess, you're not going to learn. And as you said, on the one hand, there's a lot of technical questions, and I think we should get into those just a little bit further, like, well, how do you go about this? But you first just have to embrace the simple fact that if you don't do that, you're actually not serious. If you're really serious about what you're trying to accomplish, the first thing you want to know is, how are we doing?
How are we doing? And as you were saying, there's lots of different ways potentially of doing that. We can ask master teachers of their impressions of how things are going. We can survey students. We can survey parents. One of the things that we've come back to a number of times is one of the best sources of evidence for assessing progress around learning is looking at student work. So if we think that if the main thing that innovation is creating new kinds of learning experiences for teachers and students to be involved in together, then they should be changing the kinds of practices that students are doing, and they should be changing the kind of work or the outputs that they're doing. We should be able to say, hey, look, we've been trying for a couple of years now to have our students do a better job of drawing on evidence and making arguments. We should be able to look at lab reports and history biography essays that they did 2 years ago and look at those same kinds of things now and say, hey, look, when we look at this student work, are we seeing the same kinds of patterns that we were trying to address before, or are we seeing new kinds of things? And as hard as some of these assessment conversations can be, and they certainly get to some of the stuff that we've been talking about the necessity of preparing for difficult conversations, making sure that teams of educators can really talk to each other honestly and productively, they can also, in a way, be really rejuvenating. So one of the things that we've seen a lot, for instance, in one-to-one device technology rollouts, is there are a lot of districts that get started with that work, that buy a lot of devices, that pass them out, and they don't see a lot of practices change and feel a little bit stuck. One of the ways to get unstuck is to start asking the question, well, where have we gotten? What have we learned from doing this? One of the things that you almost always see happen in those circumstances is people start asking the question, well, what should we measure, and what were we trying to accomplish to begin with? And that is such a great moment in schools to say, yes, absolutely, what were we trying to accomplish? Measurement can help us loop back towards those questions of aspiration, towards those questions of setting vision and saying, okay, I guess what we were really trying to accomplish when we bought all these devices was not to hand out devices to people. It was to create these kinds of learning experiences. And if we think that we're creating these kinds of learning experiences, we should see this kind of evidence in student work and teaching.
It's a wonderful example of what I was trying to point to, that if you're serious about something, you want to assess how you're doing. And in turn, it can be a way to make you more serious. Like, we bought all these devices. Well, what's happened? Well, what do we want to happen? So it gives you a chance for that reflection. But you also move very quickly over what is the big trap, the pitfall. Mm-hmm. And that is, when you really assess seriously, you find out sometimes it didn't work out too well. And nobody likes to know it's not working. I mean, if this is my baby and I really care about it, to find out I thought we were here, but the facts kind of suggest we're here, that's a very basic challenge emotionally. So we just need to accept that. But it really gets confounded because it's often collective. So, groups have to learn how to support each other, looking as objectively as they can at evidence, and then dealing with the emotions. I always find that the real irony here is, on the one hand, this is about being objective.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's all about emotions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's dealing with the emotion of, no, it's not actually working, or it's kind of working, but it's not the way we thought it was. And there's some people who are really angry over here. If you get serious about assessment, you're going to get into a complex emotional territory. You should be ready.
Yeah. And it's not just neck up learning. It's going to be learning that happens with
And I think that's where it often falls down. People say, oh yeah, we got to gather data. Who says you should be not evidence-based? You ever heard anybody make a good argument for why we should ignore evidence? Nobody ever makes that argument. Why isn't it used more? I think the main reason it's not used more is that subtly or implicitly we kind of know that maybe we don't want to know.
Yeah. And there's all these challenges in there, but I think another place that you and I both end up with this is another place where it's not worth taking months and months to plan exactly what the perfect assessment plan is. Right. The first thing to start doing is say, what are the steps that we can take to get into this, to launch it, to get it started, and then it's through that process of doing that we're going to learn the right path to take moving forward.
Yeah.